Morning, Elsa.
Good morning, Olivia, and welcome everybody to our first episode ever.
Welcome to our podcast called The Me and Us. So, The Me and Us is a podcast that focuses on you as the agent of change in all your important relationships. It is first and foremost about the self in the context of a couple, a family, a group, or others. It's a conversation between two relationship therapists providing both their personal and clinical perspective.
Exactly, that's right. And before we get further into today's topic, I wanted to give a brief introduction of the wonderful Olivia. She is a licensed marriage and family therapist and has been in private practice for over a decade, working with couples, individuals, and families based out of Miami. And then she also has a PhD from Nova Southeastern University. She's married and has two children, first a girl and then a boy. And she comes from a blended remarried family. She's Swiss American, so she lived in Switzerland during her childhood. And she's bilingual. She speaks German, Swiss German, English, and I know she also speaks a little bit of Spanish, although she doesn't really advertise that too much.
Just a little.
And then Olivia likes cooking, gardening, horseback riding. She plays tennis, likes to practice yoga, animal lover, and loves to read.
Thank you, Elsa. Well, I have to introduce the wonderful Elsa. She is a licensed marriage and family therapist and has been in private practice for 3 years. She has a master's from Nova Southeastern University and also an undergrad in finance from Georgetown University. She is married and has 3 beautiful daughters, and she's also Venezuelan. And we do have a Swiss connection because I'm Swiss, and Elsa also spends a lot of time in Switzerland with her family and has so for many years. So actually, we have a lot of things in common. I guess we can touch on that later. So Elsa is a middle child. She has an older brother and a younger sister. She speaks fluent Spanish and she loves to horseback ride. And what other things do you like to do, Elsa?
That's a good question. I was thinking, what do I do with my free time, and realize that I don't have much free time. And I think that's why that category is running a little empty. Theoretically speaking, I like to read a lot. I'm having a hard time finding a balance between reading interesting books from our field as well as just reading other lighter, entertaining stuff. But it's definitely a priority this year. And maybe I'd add watching some TV in there, although I'm not necessarily proud, but it's a true reflection of what I do with the little free time I have. So I'll just put it in there.
Absolutely. I forgot to add that. I love a good TV show, so can't miss that. So, what are we talking about today?
It's interesting because we kind of ended up picking a topic that it's going to be number one, but it's not usually my number one priority. And this may sound shocking, but it's friendships, right? Friendships and the personal connections that we make with people who aren't our partners or our family. And I was actually thinking about what makes a friendship. And I was thinking about how you and I met and how we became friends, but also connected professionally. And now we're no longer living in the same country. And I just think it would be interesting for us to explore, the role that friendships play. And maybe we can take a look at how ours has evolved.
Absolutely. And I think we came to this topic because we were talking about, we have busy lives. We're mothers. We have, our private practice. And how much time do you have for friends right now? Right. And part
Mhm.
of, I think, what brought us together again, now that I'm living here for now, is this podcast. And also because, now we're both two therapists and we have a lot in common and a lot to talk about. And so we're also on the board together of an organization. So we get to see each other then. But, when we met, we were, or I was a therapist, you were not yet a therapist. And yeah, so I think we talked about like how much, what makes a friendship, how much time do you need to spend together,
Mhm.
or what makes a connection,
Yes,
right?
and one thing I love to talk about with my clients and think about personally is, what is important in your life? What is a priority? You have 24 hours a day. How are you going to spend them? And how to get really clear about how you distribute your time. Because there's enormous amounts of like external factors that call for our attention. And in today's world, we're so busy that it really requires for us to sometimes be able to say, this is what I'm going to give my time to, knowing that you're leaving things behind. And when I think of my priorities, usually it's going to be family and work, top two by far. And friendships will come, I don't even know if third or even a little further down. And that's hard for me to say out loud, but it's a reality. That's just how the chips fall. But then I also fundamentally know that friendships are important. And so I struggle with understanding, when I think of friendships in terms of quantity, it's very difficult for me to make room for them in my life. But when I shift to thinking about friendships in terms of quality, then I'm like, oh, okay, I can have those too.
Mhm. Yes, I absolutely agree. And it's interesting that you ask that question to your clients because I love to ask that question a little bit in a different way. I use energy and I ask clients, out of 100, where does their energy go? To what,
Mhm.
parts of their life? And it's always interesting to hear the responses and to see sort of their reaction when they realize an important part of their life, or at least what they think is, gets very little energy from them, right? And
Mm,
I agree with you. I think it also depends on the person. I think some people are much more social and need contact with others, right? They need to be constantly engaged in sort of contact with friends, and I think there are people who like to be in groups of friends, right? They have
mm.
these cliques and they hang out together. And other people like more one on one contact. And I think for myself, like I would have to agree and sort of, say like you, it probably doesn't take up as much space in my life as, let's say my family and maybe even my hobbies, and a huge part are my dogs that take up, and I think they
Mm.
are a huge part of my friendship, because I spend so much time with them and they require a lot of my attention too. So,
They're
but
definitely a priority.
they're definitely a priority. And so I find myself sort of less in need of sort of, that constant contact, but it is on my mind too, where I say, okay,
Uh-huh.
I need to check in with that friend. I haven't spoken to that friend. What are they doing? I have to, there is a responsibility in keeping a friendship and a connection going. I have to do my part in it too. And so I am always aware of it,
Mm.
and it's challenging to navigate in a world where there's a lot going on, or at least like right now in my life.
Right. It occupies a lot of space in my mind too, but I have a couple questions for you. So
Mhm.
going back to this exercise of energy and how much, percentage, like what percentage friendships take up in your life, how much would you give it in terms of just,
Ooh.
putting you grilling you here.
So we're talking about friendship with not family, and
Mhm.
I mean just friends, and I mean I would probably say maybe 30%, 20. I'm
Wow. I
30.
was I was thinking for me it would be like 15, 20 at most. And it's funny
Yeah.
you said 30, almost thinking it's
I
too
know.
little.
When I said 30, I was like, "That's a little that's a little high."
Maybe that's the difference between the space it occupies in your mind and how much time you actually have to dedicate
Yeah.
to it.
But, I think I also recognize, for me at least, I'm somebody that has less friends, but I have very close friends.
That was
And
my well, I like that. I like that. My second question was going to be you mentioned about people that like big groups and cliques. Are you more the like big group type of person or more like individual one-on-one relationships?
I would say I'm absolutely one-on-one. I find groups take way too much of my energy, and I think they're work. I think they sap my energy, and not that it's not fun to be in groups, but it's just I've never gravitated towards that. I've
Mhm,
definitely been more one-on-one, and not that I've brought friends together. I mean, I've done that too, that have known each other for many years, but I like to have more one-on-one contact. I think it's more intimate, it's more, um, I think it's easier. It's just
mhm.
there's less drama too.
That's a good point. The drama that comes with friendships. When I think of my ideal friendships and how I bring them to life nowadays, it'll usually be a nice lunch one on one with a friend or dinner with couples. What's really neat is that my husband and I have developed like really great couple friends, and you and your husband are one of those. We just don't get to
Mhm.
see you
I
as
know,
often, but
right? I know.
a dinner between four of us, I think is a perfect setting for me nowadays.
Always my favorite thing as well, which is a challenge because it's not easy to find friends and couples that where your spouses get along, and the women get along. It's challenging to find that, but when you do, it's super special, and
Mhm.
they're also some of my favorite times. And I agree, lunches with friends, I'm not a big phone talker. And I'm not, over the years, the older I get, the less I have energy to text. And I just am more and more moving away from the gadgets. So I do prefer one on one, contact, lunch, dinner,
Mhm.
some activity.
I laugh because I have an allergy to my
Here.
phone as well. After a 7-minute marker on that timer, I'm like, okay, I don't have the focus or time for this. But
I think you
in
taught me.
person, it changes.
I
I
think you
taught you
taught me
what to use voice notes.
yes, which has been a lifesaver. And I've heard that some people get very,
Upset by them.
upset by it, and I just find it, like, such a great thing. I'm like, "Why don't I use this more?"
They're awesome. You get to hear a person's voice, but listen to it with your
Yes,
own, timing in mind.
and you
My
don't have to
husband's one of the
type.
voice note haters, but
Always
I'm a big fan. Yeah, I'm a big
I
fan.
love them. So
You know,
we have to talk about how we met too, right? And just,
okay,
like,
that's
sort
a good
of
idea.
that story. So we met, I remember our husbands were friends, and we invited you over to dinner, right? And I don't think we have met at that time. I think
We
I've
had not.
no, but I knew who you were, but we had not met.
Because
And
I think it's an important piece of background. We lived in the same neighborhood. And so we had there's a little bit of a community. So we had a
right.
sense of who the other was, but we just hadn't met one on one.
Exactly. You were a few streets over from
Mhm.
me, and we just had such a lovely night. I just felt like we totally connected and hit it off, and it was just really pleasant. I just
And
remember it being, and it was the first of many dinners
yeah,
that we did, right, at our homes, where one of us would
but
cook, and
that
um,
dinner had something incredibly special for me. I've told you this before, but that dinner kind of changed the direction of my life. As you said in the intro, I had studied finance as an undergrad and I was working in banking until I had my first child. And then I stopped working once she was born. 2 years into being a mother and not really having, a career ahead of me, I was really needing to that space in my life. And I remember I was like, oh, okay, I guess I'll have to go back to finance. It's what I know. And you had a conversation with me that really changed everything. You really made me question whether that's what I wanted. And I was quick to realize that it was not. And I was like, well, what do you do? And you're like, I'm a therapist. And I was like, oh, I've always loved that field. That's amazing. Tell me more. And that tell me more led into me applying for the master's program the next morning. And so it
The
was the
next
beginning of a
morning.
friendship. The next morning, it was the beginning of a friendship. And also, it was the beginning of this whole career of mine that I think gives an extra dimension to our friendship because
Yeah.
you've been a mentor, we've shared office, we are peers, and so it really gives a lot of different points of connection to our friendship. So thank you again.
Oh, I really had just such a strong feeling that you would love it and that you would be a very good therapist. And all of that came true. And it's just been so wonderful to see because it was also sort of looking back at when I started the program and
Right.
I saw you approaching it very similarly, just like full in, you just loved learning. Yeah. So I'm super proud of you.
Thank you. Just yesterday, I was talking to a client about the difference between chemistry and compatibility. I was talking about it in the context of a couple, but just now, when you were telling me this, I was thinking again about that compatibility and chemistry. And, I'm kind of realizing how much impact you had on me and how much of a connection we made with just the one dinner. And I'm thinking that as you tell the story, as I hear your side of the story, I hear some chemistry that was obviously there that allowed us to, I think, get deep into that very vulnerable and honest conversation where to some degree challenged me and where I opened up to you. But then I also think that compatibility has gotten us this far because I think we share similar values and we have similar styles, like you said, in our commitment of how we approach something.
Mhm.
And I think that maybe the combination of those two things has allowed us to get this far in our friendship because it's also a low maintenance friendship, I feel like.
Exactly, exactly. And, like, think about, um well, we had some questions that we wrote down that we can get to in a little bit. But I agree. I think there was absolutely a chemistry there that I think needs to be there to some degree, right? I mean, there has to be some sort of you have to hit it off. And I think for me at least, I sort of get that very quickly, that feeling like if that's
Mm.
happening or not, and I think
And
it
if it
does.
doesn't, are you able to just let it be? Or do you find yourself pushing to make a friendship work?
No, not at all. I think it's great when it happens, and then, maybe I'll put more effort into maintaining that or that can go and develop into a friendship, but if it's not there, then I don't think it's gonna be there. Then I think
Mm.
I think it's sort of like, yes, you can work at it, but I do think it's sort of like, also when you meet, let's say, somebody you're gonna date, there has to be at least I for me, it's always been there has to be some sort of connection, some sort of like also attraction, like some sort of energy that is there that
I
either
like it.
is or is not. And that's totally fine. It's not going to be with everyone. And
You
that's
know,
okay.
and that makes me think of something. I wanted to bring it to your experience as a clinician, as a therapist. Um, I know that I've seen a lot of relationships and clients that report that, once they start dating or get into a serious relationship, they lose a lot of friendships. And that plays out very interesting across relationships. Have you heard that? This idea that once you find a significant other, friendships take like a back seat. And if you have, what do you make of it?
Well, I think I've certainly heard it. And maybe more in newer relationships, not,
Okay.
a lot of the couples that I see, they've been together for many years, so it
Okay.
doesn't come up as much, but I definitely come across it. And I sort of look at it as like, well, how much do people sort of give up other things in their life when they sort of pour everything they have into one person, right? And what does that
Mm.
mean for the relationship long term and for this person's friendship? Because yes, and even going back to couples who have been together for many years, I think you see it over time if that has happened in other areas of their life too, right? Giving up a lot of other
Mm.
things. I think it really comes out where one person, well, first of all, problems arise in the relationship and one person becomes more symptomatic, in some way of sort of like not having anything else or functioning, as I would say, more for the relationship and not for yourself.
Mm. So it's almost like this relationship, this new person in my life, this new partner has become so important to me that I need to make it my number one priority. And if I make it my number one priority, sometimes that can look like it's the only priority.
Mhm.
And that's where you find yourself maybe giving up other important areas of your life.
Has that ever happened to you?
It's That's a difficult question because again, I don't think I have very intense relationships. And I do think that there's like a yeah, I think it has. I think at the beginning of a relationship, I found myself choosing one over another a little more. And if you had I guess if you didn't have that partner, that wasn't a priority in your life. So you had extra energy to pour into different areas like friendships. And then you still have the same amount of energy or 24 hours and somebody new and important comes into your life, that's going to automatically make you redistribute. So I would say it's fair to say that my friendships did see a decrease when maybe when I met a significant other. But I think I was able to kind of bounce back and give these friendships more time in my life as I settled into my relationship. But I
Mhm.
wouldn't say it was a smooth transition. I'm also thinking about the different scenarios. Like when you're in college, so much of it for me was friendships. Like 24/7 was friendships. And then when I met my partner, I was working, and so I had very little free time.
Well, I think it's also I'm thinking of just the life cycle, right? Like you say, I think maybe when you're younger, friendships are more important. I see it with my daughter now. She's 11, and it's very important, and she's a girl, and I think during this age now, teenager, or becoming a teenager, it becomes very important for their development, especially for girls to have these friendships and even like one-on-one friendships, to have sort of a best friend, right? And calling each other BFFs, and I think it's that time, and then even in college, like I think before your life sort of becomes I don't know, more full of responsibility, I guess, with work. And, when you do meet a significant other that you're either going to marry and have children with, it even changes again because
Mhm.
I think, when you do have children, it's just, there is just not enough time. There's not even enough time I have for myself. So, let
Right.
alone for a friendship. So, I think for me, I've noticed at least, this last decade has been very active because I have young children and I'm working and, maintaining a home and all of those things. Um, that it's very important for me to have time for myself. And that's
Mhm.
why, I do make it a priority to have my hobbies and to
Yeah.
do things that are important to me and that sort of rebuild my energy. And a lot of those things are not necessarily with a friend. It's maybe with people, but it's more something that I do,
For
like
yourself.
horseback riding, or when I was cycling. I was in a group and there was a lot of socializing, but this was more a group setting and it was not like it didn't take that much energy to maintain those relationships. And that's why I
Mm.
say, like, I have those. few good relationships that I do, um, you know, try to put as much effort into maintaining, that connection. And
Mm,
I hope it always goes both ways, right? And I think generally speaking, it does when I show up for it, with
okay.
those particular people. But it does take effort too, especially when you're not living in the same place. And one thing I wanted to ask you and bring up when I was thinking about this is, and I'm curious to hear your experience on this, that when we, as you mentioned, we live in a neighborhood where we had, you become friends with a lot of the people and families who live there because it's
Mhm.
also out of convenience. And especially when you have kids, your kids play together, and maybe
Circumstantial.
you walk down the street and go to dinner to another neighbor, and you walk home and you don't have to get in a car, you don't have to sit in traffic. Everything is just easy.
Yes.
And I think, like, so there's that in your life, like your everyday life. And then you have friends that you maybe don't see in years. And maybe this was a college friend, maybe this was a childhood friend, maybe this was a friend that moved away. And you keep in contact with that person, but you don't talk to that person as much. And
Mhm.
maybe, though, I think what's special, if it is, when you do have contact with those people who you don't talk to as much, you kind of pick up right from where you left off, and everything feels natural. And sometimes I think that I wonder if those relationships that are maybe more distant in some way in your
Mhm.
everyday life, you feel more, um, sort of, you can tell them, let's say, more secrets, or you can open up more to that person, and you don't feel judged, and you don't feel like, there's just more room in that relationship despite the distance and the space,
Mhm.
versus when with people that you're very good friends with and that you see every day, but they're much more involved in your life. Those are maybe the friendships where you're more careful to share very private things, right? Because it's more
That's
like, it's more, you're more exposed in some way. And I just find that very interesting because, yeah, I've
That is
experienced
super
both.
interesting. I have definitely experienced those two different types of friendships, and there's the people that you share with a lot of your life because of the circumstances. Maybe your kids go to school together or you live in the same neighborhood. And there's also compatibility and chemistry because there's people
Mhm.
that share the same circumstances and you don't actually spend time with them. So you can be friendly. I think I am friendly with quite a few people in our neighborhood in school. But then, do I consider those the friendships that I connect with? I don't know. I mean, those are friendships too. I guess what I'm thinking about is what you said about how vulnerable you are, or if you guard yourself. That's interesting. I hadn't thought of that. I'm trying to think if I'm ever vulnerable with friends. I think it would be
Oh,
very few
interesting.
friends that I'm very, very vulnerable with. I just, because I was trying to think if I'm constantly thinking when I'm sharing with someone whether that's something I want to say or not. And that doesn't come to mind as something that I'm thinking about constantly, which makes me think that there are parts of my life that I'm just not usually sharing. It would be the
Mhm.
exception that I don't know, maybe I'm just too boring and I don't have too many secrets.
No, I'm thinking more of, like, if you're going through a very difficult time, or,
Yeah.
and it's sort of like, let's say you live in, or it goes back to the idea of, like, a sort of a social circle, like hanging out in a group, and is the same thing, like, in neighborhoods, right? Because when
Mhm.
you're, and I think maybe young couples who have children maybe find that because they are interacting more with each other, but you're not friends with every family or every couple.
Mhm.
And, then you tell somebody something to that person, and then that person is hanging out with somebody else. And I just feel like it's much, um, yeah, it's sort of like you're more, or I'm at least maybe more cautious in that setting to just sort of, expose myself versus again these one-on-one relationships that I have. And not that I don't have that or that it's not possible in that kind of setting, but
Mhm.
it goes back to there's just this my thinking is just about what in a friendship when there is space, like so the idea of like somebody not being in your presence all the time, right?
Mhm.
Is there room for more acceptance in a person? When
Mm.
you are sort of not really knowing what is happening on the day in and out of somebody's life, but you feel a really strong connection to that person, and can really open up and share private things with that person,
Yes.
and it makes me think, is that possible because of that space and room
I love
that is
that.
sort of allowed, the acceptance of letting the other person be who they are, and that's what makes a good
I
friendship.
think two concepts come to mind, and one is the idea that there's less noise and less clutter from like the day to
Mhm.
day, more, and that applies to all relationships. Sometimes we think we're talking to someone because we're telling them what we're doing that day, like, oh, are you picking up the girls, are you da, 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 and you think you're in contact, but you're really, it's just like a lot of noise. And when you are spending a lot of time with people, that's kind of the nature of it, because you're kind of checking in and making plans. Da, da, da. Whereas a friendship that you don't report to, sort of your day to day, there's less noise and clutter. So when you speak, maybe everything you say has a little more meaning, or you choose more carefully what you are sharing. And
Mhm.
then the other thing I was thinking about is expectations. Maybe subconsciously or without knowing, we have more expectations of the people that we are spending time with, like, did they call, or am I invited to the play date, or
Right.
are we going to see each other? There's like more pressure
Yeah,
to
absolutely.
keep that constant contact. And I think that when you have less expectations from a relationship, there is freedom, there's more freedom, and there's more space to
Yes,
show up more
absolutely.
genuinely. And so, what expectations do you have of those friendships that are, a little bit more long distance, that you don't see constantly? Maybe less. I think that
Yeah,
would definitely be the case
absolutely.
for me.
And I always say that if you wanna avoid disappointment, lower your expectations because
Yes.
I
It's kind of
think,
like a little formula. Lower expectations equals more freedom, and
yeah,
then more freedom equals more
yeah,
fulfilling
and more
relationships.
satisfaction and yeah, absolutely. That's interesting. Well, so here we have some questions that we
Okay.
came up with when we were thinking of this topic, and, a couple of the questions, and maybe this is something, for you to think about, um, is markers of an anxious relationship. What are markers of an anxious relationship? And I can I'll pick at that for a second.
Okay. Go for it.
I think for me, a marker of an anxious relationship would be how much energy is going into sort of trying to change the other person in a relationship. And that comes from like maybe with giving advice or arguing or not accepting sort of the other's opinion or choices. And I think another marker would be if there's a lot of worry about how much time is spent together,
Mm.
what.
I would add something else to that, which is what I was thinking is, if you spend a lot of time worrying about what the other person is thinking about, especially in
Oh yeah,
friendships, that to
absolutely.
me is a huge
Mhm.
one.
So, and maybe
Okay.
you have some other ones, but that is, I love to think in terms of markers of anything really. I think
Hmm.
that's such a great way to sort of assess your own functioning and your own relationships. Another
That's a great
question
one.
would be, what makes you feel connected to someone?
Okay. So I think just a couple of thoughts on that one. Makes you feel connected is the fact that you feel safe. Like the fact that you maybe don't feel you need to be guarding yourself, so that you can be a little less anxious. Um, in connection to that person. And another one that comes to mind is humor. When you find someone you can laugh with, that to me is instant connection.
Absolutely. I love to laugh, and, I would agree. I think there has to be sort of, a shared, giving and taking. I don't know if that's just energy. I also think there has to be you have to have things in common, something, right? You have to
Okay,
have certain
fair
things in
enough.
common that keep a connection going or make that connection.
Okay. Another question is, how do you define a strong relationship? Friendship, sorry.
I think if there's again, it goes back to sort of, having something in common, when there's enough sort of space to allow the other person, to be who they are, to
Mhm.
not have, too many or any expectations really, or
Yeah.
maybe just not too many, where it
I
sort of sets you up for disappointment.
Yes.
Um,
To me, I'm thinking reciprocity, where you feel that and it's not that you're focused on what you're getting out of it, but that it feels reciprocal, that you feel that if you're putting in effort, the other person cares too. And maybe that may look like you calling them 3 times before they call you back once, that's fine. But just that you feel that that person cares as well. Because if I'm going to put my time into it, then I want to make sure that it's a relationship that goes both ways. And I was also thinking about quality over quantity, a friendship that can withstand, maybe the test of time. Maybe we don't see each other for 2 years, but when we meet again, the quality is there, that
Mhm.
ability to start where we left off.
Right. And then it's always the question, do you need to have a history to
Mm,
survive that, to make that sort of possible or not? I don't know. That's a question, but I agree. I think there absolutely has to be a give and take, and I think you just can't, if you want to have a friendship, you have to show up for it and you have to put something into it. But if you're only putting in and not getting anything in return, I think that leads to our next question, have you ever found yourself in an over functioning or under functioning relationship? Do you connect these ideas to being type A or type B personality? That's interesting.
yeah. It's very easy to be in an over functioning or under functioning relationship. I think especially if you're looking at it from a very specific lens, like who calls more, or how often do I invite to dinner and the other person never shows up that way. But that would be a little bit narrow minded. I think it's important when you're assessing over functioning and under functioning to really measure the relationship um, from like different perspectives and like a wider lens in terms of just like general satisfaction and again chemistry, compatibility, and that you don't feel you need to overfunction in order for the relationship to survive. If you choose to call more because you want to, that's fine. But then if you don't and that person is never really going to call you, then that's a different story. I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah, I do. And when I think of over functioning, under functioning, I just automatically thought of that appearing more in well, I was thinking of romantic relationships because or the closer relationships, the heavier relationships, the ones that do come with expectations, the unspoken expectations where over functioning and under functioning can be much more apparent, and people then really um yeah, can struggle with that, right? The find themselves in an over functioning relationship and not knowing what to do about it or how to get out of that, right?
Yes. And then last but not least, how do you determine a healthy friendship over a draining toxic friendship? And I have to think that that really will depend on each person. But for me, something that is draining is not being able to, somebody who varies a lot, who treats you differently depending on the setting, or somebody that's not reliable, somebody that gives you their word and then just you never
Mm.
know where you're standing with them. That drains me. And so, um, I've asked myself if that's me having too high expectations of someone else, But I don't think so. I think that to me is the bare minimum to be able to be at peace and not anxious in a relationship. That I can know where I'm standing with a person and that I can count on them if they've offered.
Yeah. I would have to agree with, doing what you say you're going to do. And if that doesn't happen, then I always say actions are louder than words. And that is for me a big marker on if that is, and ends up being a draining relationship or not. And also, I think, I think for me, if I end up becoming sort of, I think as a therapist, I naturally a listener. I listen more than sort of am the one, you know, sharing or looking for advice. I think it's just, I think it's also because I'm a younger sibling. I'm just more, that's just more who I am. But if I find myself, sort of listening all the time or sort of playing therapist with a friend nonstop, then I sort of,
Either pay me for the session or hang up the phone.
yes. And then, it's just like, and if that happens over and over again, then I do find myself drained and sort of like, well, what am I getting from this? And maybe that's also on me I think I have to take responsibility in that too, where I have to then sort of speak up, I have to set boundaries then, or I have to sort of make room for myself in a
Mm.
relationship like that, and then either it balances out or it doesn't, right? But that would be sort of an example for me.
So you'd want a conversation, a dialogue, really. And what you're talking about is creating that reciprocity. And if it doesn't feel reciprocal, maybe it's just
Yeah.
not it.
Maybe it then will require less energy from me.
Well, if anything, this episode is our best attempt to create another form of connection that is meaningful to you and I. And I hope that other people will find our thoughts and our conversation interesting and useful.
I second that. Thank you. This was fun, Elsa. I like this. This made me think and ask questions and sort of reflect. And I think that's the idea of the podcast. And, being two relationship therapists, our conversations will always, involve something relational, something about, relationships in
Yeah.
life.
And I was thinking that they, kind of recapping the episode, we went from personal to clinical to theory. There's thinking, there's feeling, and a little vulnerability. And that was fun. Definitely very dynamic.
We hope to see you on the next one.